Hello, everyone. This is Ed Densel, host of Unfound. I wonder if you will consider becoming a supporter of this YouTube channel. By pressing the join button below, you can receive, for just 10 cents a day, the video version of the podcast a day early, the Unfound Now episodes a week early, daily video updates from yours truly, and cool emojis to use during the Monday night live show. Please consider it as you watch the following spectacular video. Thanks. Richard Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey were a 20-year-old and 18-year-old from Gloucester and Grafton, Virginia, respectively. They had a college class together. On April 9th, 1988, Keith and Sandra were on their first date. They went to a party in Newport News, then left sometime after midnight. Keith's car was found just hours later on the Colonial Parkway. They were never seen again. I'm Ed Densel, and this is the first of a two-part episode of Unfound. Yep, this is the two-parter, and these are the disappearances I've been teasing for a few weeks now on these episodes and on the live show on YouTube. And yes, if you're wondering, Keith and Sandra, as they were known by everyone back then, are the only two disappearances contained within the greater phenomenon that is now known as the Colonial Parkway murders. The killing of three couples, and the disappearances of these two young people. Over the years, there have been books, websites, web sleuth threads, Reddit posts, and even a Wikipedia page devoted to trying to figure out if all of them are connected or separate incidents. Was there a serial killer in that area of Virginia, or was it all the work of multiple unconnected assailants? Well, in this episode and the next, Unfound is going to do something that's never been done before. We are going to examine Keith and Sandra's case all by itself, with only a bit of comparing and contrasting with the murders. I plan to apply everything we've learned over the past 6+ years concerning missing persons cases to figure out what happened to cause the Colonial Parkway disappearances. And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Linez's website, charleyproject.org. Keith Call, in both hearing about him and reading about him, was pretty much the nicest guy you ever wanted to meet. Studious, friendly, even taking his younger brother to the movies on Sundays. He had no addictions, no problems with the law, no allegations of any behavioral or mental issues. And Keith had a girlfriend, Selena, of 4 years. However, at the time of Keith's disappearance, the two were on what we now in the 21st century call a break. Sandra Hailey was pretty much like Keith. No addictions, no problems with the law, certainly no behavioral or mental issues. However, Sandra was certainly more outgoing and popular than Keith. She was a cheerleader, a gymnastics coach, and Sandra worked part-time at a hair salon to pay her way through Christopher Newport College. She had a boyfriend, Terry, in high school, but they had broken up sometime after Sandra graduated in 1987. She had a class with Keith, and this is how they ended up going out for the first time on April 9th, 1988. So that evening, Keith picked Sandra up at her home in Grafton, Virginia. They went to the movies. Eventually, the two arrived at an apartment party near the Christopher Newport College campus in Newport News, where they went to school. Witnesses noted Keith and Sandra did not spend very much time together there. Sandra encountered, coincidentally or not, her former boyfriend, Terry, and some of his friends, while Keith stood virtually by himself. Eventually, Keith and Sandra left the party. However, their departure time could have been anywhere from 11:30 p.m. to 2:15 a.m. In addition, nobody can reliably say if the two left alone or with others. However, neither made it home. They were never seen again. Around 4 a.m. April 10th, just hours later, Keith's car was seen parked in a pull-off on the Colonial Parkway, about a half hour from the apartment. Their clothes and shoes were in it, with the scene appearing as if Keith and Sandra had gone for a skinny dip in the nearby York River, despite the water being deathly cold. Searches were done. No evidence of the two were found. Distressingly, Keith's car was only a mile from where two women had been stabbed to death in a vehicle 2 years before. Two murders that are still unsolved to this day. For this part 1, you will hear the first halves of interviews I've done with siblings of Keith and Sandra. Then in my summation, which is way longer than usual, I will begin to detail some of the work I've done since the summer of 2022, when I happened upon Keith and Sandra's case. In addition, I will explain my analysis as I worked my way through the mountain of information concerning the Colonial Parkway murders. For those of you who have been around long enough, this will remind you of the work I did in 2019 for the Cameron Remmer disappearance. But as we start this long journey, we'll be on for the next 2 weeks, I want you to contemplate these 3 questions as you listen to the rest of part 1. Number 1, remembering that disappearances are all about people, what type of disappearance were Keith and Sandra most likely to encounter given who they were? Number 2, would these two have really gone to the Parkway knowing what happened in the preceding 2 years? And number 3, why do some killers leave their victims behind while others hide their victims? Keith's and Sandra's families have no doubt that foul play occurred, although they waver back and forth as to whether the disappearances are connected to the murders. The guests for both parts 1 and 2 are Joyce Call Canada and Chris Call, siblings of Keith Call, and Terry Hailey Holman, sister of Sandra Hailey. Unfound News. The latest Unfound Now is now available to the public on the YouTube channel. Coincidentally, the disappearance in the episode got solved just days before making it watchable. That's a first. Still, please check out the video because there are some excellent educational points in it. Next, we have update episode number 13 coming up the last Friday of this month. Yep, lucky number 13. I have to be honest, I didn't think Unfound would even make it to update episode number 7. Funny how these things turn out. Finally, I'm going to Pennsylvania on December 22nd and coming back on the 30th. I predict no delays concerning the podcast or replying to any of your messages. The work will continue. Where you can find Unfound on these following podcast platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, and many others, especially outside the United States. The new podcast, Unfound Live, which comes out on Tuesdays, can also be found on these platforms. social media sites, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and the newest one, TikTok. Listener support sites, patreon.com/Unfound Podcast, paypal.me/Unfound Podcast. The website, theunfoundpodcast.com. The email address, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. And please mention Unfound at all true crime websites and forums. Thank you. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the sister of Cassandra Hailey, Terry Hailey Holman. Terry, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you.
For the purposes of this discussion today, we're doing this interview, by the way, for all the listeners and viewers on December 7th, 2022. I know sometimes that when we have talked that you've referred to her as Sandra. Is that how you would like us to refer to her during this conversation? Or what did you call her back then? Sandra?
Well, I called her Missy.
Oh, Missy. You called her Missy.
Yeah, okay, most people knew her as Sandra.
Okay, we will call her Sandra. Okay, Terry. So, Terry, thank you for joining us today regarding Sandra and Keith's disappearances. Just to give an idea, what was the Hailey home like during the 1980s? My understanding is you are Sandra's older sister. How many other siblings do you have? What can you say about the Haileys during the 1980s? And I'm around the same age, so I remember the 1980s fairly well, too. What can you say?
It was a lot of fun. We didn't go out a lot, but we had a lot of friends over back then when I was free and when everybody was free. We were all working at the same time and doing a lot of stuff. Sandra was working a lot and going to school. So our time didn't add up to being free at the same time a lot.
Yeah.
But at the time when we were all there, it was fun.
Mm-hmm. So you have one more sibling besides you two?
Yeah, there's one in the middle.
Okay. Another sister?
Yes.
All three girls. How did your father feel about that?
He was spoiled. He was well taken care of.
Okay. All right. So he was the only male in the family. Your mother and three girls, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, and maybe I should ask you this. How many years older are you than Sandra?
Almost 10.
Wow. Okay. So a little bit of a separation. So you're like 9 when she was born. So when she went missing,
I was more like a mom than a sister.
Yeah, right. Of course. So she gets to be 7 or 8. Maybe you had some like babysitting duties once in a while, something like that.
I had a lot of babysitting duties.
Okay. Okay. All right. So that was, and your parents were married. You all lived in the same house growing up.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
We were military, so we moved a lot until we moved to Virginia. And then my dad retired, and then they stayed in this house.
I don't think I knew that. Okay. What branch of the military?
Air Force.
Air Force. Okay. Okay. And what was he? Well, let's just ask. I need to ask you that. What was your father in the Air Force? What did he do?
He was an ammunition crew chief.
Taking care of the bullets and the missiles. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Very neat. Okay. Well, let's move on to talking about Sandra a little bit. Like you said, you were 9 years older, almost kind of like a second mother to her. What are some of the personality traits, interests, hobbies? Maybe you want to talk about what it was like to babysit her back in maybe, I guess it would be like the early 80s. What can you say about all of that, her personality and things that Sandra was into as a girl?
She was into gymnastics, cheerleading.
Mm-hmm.
She was a good baby. She really was. She didn't get into any trouble.
Mm-hmm. So she wasn't a handful?
Sometimes she didn't listen. I mean, one time we went camping and Paula and I wanted to go exploring, and we told her to wait here, we'll be right back. And because we were crossing a log that went across water, and we told her to wait because she was too small to cross that log. few seconds later, we hear a splash and hear her screaming, and she didn't wait. She fell in.
All
We
right.
had to run back. My mom and dad heard her fall. So, yeah, she didn't listen real well.
All right. And so she had to get rescued. Okay.
Yeah, she was a little adventurous.
Okay. I can understand that. Okay. And so babysitting her, like I said, maybe you're a teenager. Maybe she's like 5 or 6 or something like that. No big deal, though.
No.
Fairly well behaved.
Well, she was the first one of us to get a broken bone.
Oh, she was. Okay. How did that happen?
She fell off the monkey bars and broke her arm. So, she was fearless.
Okay, she's fearless, likes to climb on logs, goes into the water, monkey bars, and all. Okay. All right, so she was into maybe gymnastics. Maybe that's where that came from. She wants to jump off things and roll around. And okay. What about her personality? Introverted, extroverted, made friends easily? What would you say?
Very outgoing.
Mm-hmm.
Very outgoing, very trusting, very she would give you the shirt off her back. She would give you her last dollar.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And being that you were 9 years older than her, and once again, as you stated, like a second mother, did that then change into more like a friendship as sisters usually have, or did it still continue to be kind of that mother-daughter thing going on, even though you weren't technically her mother? How would you explain that? Like when she got to maybe like
there were times that we were friends and we hung out as friends, and then there were other times that I butted in and tried to mother. Yeah. Okay. And it got ugly, but
okay. And what about your middle sister? What role did she play in all of this? And what do you think she would say?
They were always buddies.
They were always buddies. How close are they in age?
3 years.
3 years.
They're 3 years apart.
All right. So, and you're 6 years older than your middle sister. Okay. So it was you, and then some years, and then your middle sister, and then Sandra, all in the 3 years. Okay. Getting up, now we have to understand that you, at the time of her disappearance in 1988, you had already moved out. In fact, I think that you were married by this time, maybe?
I'd been gone for a long time. Yeah.
Gone for a long time. Okay. At what point did you move out of your house? How long had you not lived, like, under the same roof that Sandra had? How long had that been?
1979.
Wow, you didn't waste any time. You were like, I'm 18, I'm out of here.
Nope.
Okay.
My mom gave me a suitcase for graduation.
Kind of sending you a message?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well,
yeah.
Touche to mom. All right. And do you think that, but that didn't happen, I guess, with Sandra, because she, of course, was still living at home. Of course, she was going to college, and we're going to talk about that, but she was still living at home. Different standard there, or just different personality?
Big time difference.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. If I was a minute late for my midnight curfew, I was grounded for weeks.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Sandra, a little different,
there was a big difference with each one.
Okay, so from 1979, when she gave you the luggage to get out, to 1987/88, when Sandra graduated from high school, things had changed. And
and I was already 18 when I graduated high school.
Yeah.
But the rules were still different.
Yeah. Okay. So different standards. She's the baby of the family, and maybe that happens in a lot of families. Okay. All right. So different standards. She gets into high school, and of course, you moved out. You're on the way. But what do you understand about her high school years? We're going to get into some specifics here in a moment. But what do you understand about her high school years? She do well in school? What do you think that she wanted? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, as far as I know, she did. I know her primary focus was gymnastics and cheerleading. As far as the grades, I really don't know.
Okay. And did she ever talk about, maybe when you spoke to her, what were her aspirations for a career? Of course, we know where she went to school, but do you have any ideas what she wanted to do with life? Be a teacher, engineer? No idea. It never came up. Okay. All right.
I don't know that she knew yet.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's not unusual. A lot of kids are like that. including
Yeah.
myself, back at that time. Okay. So she's outgoing, she's into cheerleading, and I guess we just take for granted that cheerleaders are usually fairly popular. And even I know, once again, being that this is my generation, Generation X. So let's move on to this. Some items. Do you have any idea how she ended up picking Christopher Newport as her school to go to? Do you think that she looked at any other schools, like Old Dominion or any other schools in that area? Any idea whatsoever?
I don't know, but maybe because my sister Paula went there.
Oh, she did.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was close to home. She could live at home and go because my parents weren't paying for it, so she had to pay for it.
Oh, okay.
So
all right. And so she was paying for her education. Okay.
Yeah.
What work was she doing? How was she? I'm guessing she got some loans, of course.
But
what
she
was
worked
she doing
at Regis. She was a nanny. She also helped coach gymnastics at one of the high schools. So she had several different jobs.
Okay, so she was fairly busy. I mean, between school
She
and
was
work,
really busy.
not a lot of time for other things, I guess.
Not really.
Okay. Did you say Regis? What is that?
A hair salon?
Oh, okay. Did she cut hair?
No, she was the front receptionist.
Oh, front receptionist.
She made all the appointments.
Oh, okay. All right. She's doing that.
And she let them practice on her hair because she had beautiful hair. So
I saw that. Yes.
She disappeared. They asked what color hair she had, and we all had to look at each other and go, "What color was it this week?" Because they were constantly changing her hair.
Okay. So she was getting her hair done for free then.
Yeah.
That's a nice deal for women. That's a big deal. That can save women a lot of money for sure.
Yeah.
That's a nice deal.
Sometimes it was short, sometimes it was long.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we were kind of like, well, we think it was red this week, but we're not sure.
Okay. All right. So she's certainly not a lazy young woman. She's going to school. No. She's getting her education. She's paying for education, which I did not, to be honest. But a lot of kids that do that, you have the utmost respect for them. Working and through school, it can be very difficult. So a lot of good qualities of her. Let's move on to this. And the reason we're going to talk about him is because he was at this party that night. But what can we say about Terry Kirby? Of course, his name has been out there before. In fact, it's even mentioned in the book that's been written about the murders and disappearances that everybody's connected together. What can you say about them dating in high school? What did you know about it? What can you say?
I didn't know about it until after the fact.
Is that just because she kept her boyfriend's kind of secret? Of course, you had moved out. Do you think that your parents knew that the two were dating, or was it something that was on the down low?
My mom knew.
Okay.
And my sister Paula knew. Mm-hmm. Why I didn't know, I have no idea.
Okay, so in all the conversations you ever had with Sandra back at the time, Terry's name never came up.
He did, because we all went to parties at their house.
So, at the Kirby house.
Kirby's, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
But she never said anything about dating him.
Huh.
I knew they were friends, but she never really said.
Okay.
But she never said anything about dating anybody.
Okay. So they had these Kirby's had parties, and I understand that he does have some older brothers, maybe
I knew Wayne better than I knew Terry.
Okay. All right. So you knew one of Terry's older brothers.
Yes.
And what do you think, as best as you can tell, and I realize it's been 30-some years later and you really just have to go by what other people said, being that you didn't know but your mother knew, are you then saying that your father didn't know?
Not as far as I know, he didn't.
Okay. But everybody who went to the high school that they went to, I think it's called Tab High School, did everybody understand that when the two were in school that they were a couple?
As far as I know, yeah.
Okay. And we have to understand, we have to make clear, though, and this is just something that in doing my, I guess, my own work regarding this, is that technically Terry was 2 years behind Sandra in school. They were not.
Yes.
They were not in the same grade. He was
Right.
behind her in school. All right. So she's in college. He's still in high school.
Right.
Okay. Do we know anything? Of course, she didn't even know they were a couple until after she went missing. How did that even come up?
I think my mom may have said something at that point because I know
Okay.
she called him to ask him to go check, I guess, the basketball court where they hung out to see if she was there.
Okay. All right. So you didn't find out that they had been a couple in high school until after she went missing, and that you found out that through your mother.
Either my mother or my ex-husband. I can't remember which.
Okay.
Because I think he knew.
Okay. And once again, for everybody listening, the only reason we're talking about this is because a person who was very, very close to Sandra at one time just happened to be at this party, and we'll come back to this later. What have you, of course, as everybody now knows, I'm also interviewing Keith's brother and sister for the coverage of these disappearances. What is your understanding as to how Sandra and Keith knew each other? Your understanding?
From school, from college. They had shared a class together.
Okay.
Is my understanding.
All right. And once again, you knew of Terry, but Keith's name, that is not a name you had ever heard until after the disappearances occurred?
No, I met him the night that they went out.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yes,
well,
I
talk
was
a little
at
bit
my
about
mom
that
and
then.
dad's, taking my parents out to dinner. And Keith came and picked Sandra up, so I met him then.
Wow, so it was just really a coincidence. You just happened to be there at the right time.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. So you're there taking your parents out, and at roughly the same time, Sandra and Keith are going out. We know now that we're going to get into that night, but they go to a movie and then end up at this party. So you just had maybe a minute interaction with Keith.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe 5.
Okay. And when you showed up there, you maybe didn't even know that Sandra was going out? Do you even remember?
I don't remember if I knew or not.
Okay. That's fine.
I don't remember.
Okay. And do you, of course, it's been 34 years since these disappearances have happened. And talking to your other sister, Paula, do you think that she had ever heard of Keith before Sandra and Keith went out that night? Any idea?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. And your understanding is this is the first time the two ever went out?
Yeah.
They ever got together to have like a social occasion? I don't know if we want to call it a date or whatever else. But your understanding, this is the first time the two ever went out together alone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's move on to some just general questions about that area of Virginia and everything that was going on at the time. How aware were the locals, including even, of course, your family, your firsthand knowledge, how aware were locals and yourselves aware of the murders in 1986? Regarding, of course, we now know of these two women who were I guess, stabbed or slashed. Their car was burnt, and I know that you know some of those family members from both of those families. But how aware were locals, including your family, aware of what happened up on the Colonial Parkway in 1986?
I don't know about my parents. They may have been more aware of it than I was. And I don't know how I didn't know because I was still in law enforcement then, but somewhere else.
Okay.
But I traveled that road to go to and from work. And usually in the middle of the night because I worked night shift, but I didn't watch the news. So, you know, I would go home, go to sleep, wake up and go back to work. So I didn't know.
Okay.
Would you say drove right past it? Didn't know.
Okay, so it is at least conceivable that there were people in the Newport News, Gloucester area, you know, on either side of the river there, who maybe didn't know about the murders on the Parkway at all in 1986. It's at least possible.
Yeah, I lived in Gloucester at the time.
Gloucester, and really,
and I may have. So I could go home either through the parkway, go across the bridge, or I could go out and go up through West Point and go in the back way. Either way, it was an hour drive. So depending on how tired I felt, or which way I wanted to drive, it depended. I really did not know.
Okay. Would you say that
I'm sure my parents did. They watched the news.
Would you say that you didn't know about those murders until after Sandra went missing?
Yeah, I did until then. Yeah.
Okay, so that's 1986. We're just going to be very rough with this. 2 years before, we know these two women, those murders are still unsolved. They were up there in the Colonial Parkway, and they had been stabbed to death. There were no signs of rape or anything, but they were stabbed to death, and somebody tried to light the car on fire with diesel fuel, but that doesn't work due to diesel needing a higher temperature to ignite. But the person tried to get rid of the car. Those murders are still unsolved. Let's just move up to the murders then in 1987, so a year before the disappearances we're talking about of Keith and Sandra. Same thing. Were you aware of it? Were the locals aware of it at all?
No, the ones in Ragged Island? No, I didn't know about that one either.
Okay, so we realized, and everybody knows, there were articles written at the time, but what we're showing here is that, yeah, they happened, but even somebody like Terry who lived in that area, even though she's, like she said, she was in law enforcement at the time, just going about her daily life, she realized these things were going on. So it's at least conceivable a lot of other people didn't either. Do you think that Cassandra or Sandra knew about those murders after the fact? Did you ever talk to your parents? Were they, of course, when this all started to come together, do you think that Sandra knew about those murders?
I doubt she knew. She was just as busy as I was. The last thing she's going to do is sit down, read a newspaper, or sit and watch the news.
Okay.
Unless somebody actually told her about it, I doubt she knew.
Okay. Very good. So this is how things maybe, for the audience, this is how things maybe can get a little construed over the years, or misconstrued, whatever the word is, where everybody now knows because of course, books and all these TV shows have been done. But here we are, we're talking to a person who was an adult at the time, Terry, who admits, you know what? I was living my life right in the area. I was going past these spots all the time, and I didn't know. So we must kind of think that maybe a lot of other people didn't know either. And this, I think, is something important to remember.
There was not social media. There was not all this stuff where people were in your business, knowing everything, and all out there spewing it. It wasn't there.
Excellent point. That's totally true. And we're going to come back to that a little later when we get more into these particulars. Next point. Did Sandra have a curfew?
Yes.
Okay. And would you happen to be able to guess? You, of course, stated quite humorously earlier in this interview that you had a curfew, and if you were late by 1 minute, you got in trouble. What was your curfew, and do you think it was the same curfew for Sandra, and what was that curfew?
Oh, no, they were not the same. Mine was midnight.
Wow.
And hers was either 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock.
Okay. So she gets to stay. Not only is she younger, she's the baby, she gets to live at home and everything. She gets the later curfew too. Okay.
Oh, yeah. And she can call and say, oh, I'm not going to make it. I'm staying at so-and-so's house. I could not do that.
Okay. And for purposes,
I did not get that privilege.
Okay. All right. I guess that's the curse of being born first, Terry.
Yeah.
Okay. But I guess for purposes of these disappearances, then we're still not sure what the curfew is. Of course, there's a time out there that has been, 2 a.m., quote unquote.
It was 2. My mom told Keith to have her home before 2.
All right. So we're going to go by 2 a.m.
Yeah, I was there when my mom said it.
Okay. Next general question before we get into the details and explaining that night. To your knowledge, after Sandra went missing, did anything come up of her having any problems with any men at the time, being stalked, being harassed, somebody, of course, before people could email and text each other, maybe guys driving by her house, anything like that? Have you ever heard anything like that, having problems with any men?
Not that I'm aware of.
None. Okay. And there's also this out there, had Sandra been to a party at the same complex the night before?
I don't know if it was at the same complex, but I know she was out the night before.
Okay. All right.
I'm not positive if it was there or somewhere else.
Okay. So the night before, that would have been Friday night. They went missing on Saturday night. So the night before, she was out somewhere, but it was not with Keith. Do you even know? Did she go out with friends, by herself? Do we even know?
I don't know.
Okay. All right. So she had been out the night before, but we're not quite sure where she went and who she was with. Maybe that might be something that
my mom probably knows. I don't know if my mom knew. I don't know if she'll remember now. Okay. But my mom knew where she was because she called my mom and said she wasn't coming home.
Okay. All right. Did Sandra have her own car? I mean, if she was going to school, is there like a family car? How did she
had my parents' old car.
Okay, yeah. So that was the car that she exclusively drove?
Yeah.
On her own? All right. So conceivably, if it's night before, she could have driven to that party by herself because she had her own car. She didn't need picked up, for example.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to April 9th/10th of 1988. You've already stated that coincidentally you showed up at the house and there Keith was with Sandra and they were leaving. Your understanding, just in general, what do you know about their movements for that night?
They were going to a movie, and then they were going by a party.
Okay. Do you know what theater they went to? What would be the no idea?
I don't know.
Don't know.
Don't you know what they were going to see?
Okay. All right, and I might have to look that up to see what movies would have been popular in April of 1988. That might be interesting that a couple might go to see. Okay, so was there like a movie theater like near where you lived or where you grew up, I should say?
There might have been one in Patrick Henry Mall. Mm-hmm. And I know there was one in Coliseum Mall in Hampton. Mm-hmm. Those, I think, are the only two I know of.
Okay. So everybody's belief at the time is that they're going to the movies, not sure if they're going to go to dinner or whatever else, but they went to this party and then, or they went to this movie and then they went to this party. Of course, that was the last place that they were seen. And listeners should know, of course, I'm interviewing Keith's sister and brother, and they're going to add in, certainly Chris is going to add in some context to him seeing Keith before Keith ended up at Sandra's house. Okay. Just some questions about the party. What do you think, given that it was like still in the area, this college is where all of you grew up, do you think it would have been Cassandra's idea to go to this party?
Oh, sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What did the witnesses say about, and I've talked to them before people are hearing our voice or seeing us. I've gotten to talk to a couple of these witnesses, but what can you say the witnesses said about Cassandra and Keith at this party? What were they doing? What's the general consensus?
That they were talking separately to other people, not really talking to each other. Mm-hmm. And it didn't look like they were having that good of a time. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. That was pretty much it. Okay, so they went to the party together, but it seems as soon as they got there, Sandra goes off and they kind of split up. Yeah. For the time. Okay, and this is what two different witnesses said. Okay. And as we spoke before, Terry Kirby was there. Yes. Okay. Do you think that Sandra knew he was going to be there? I don't know, but I would venture to guess she assumed he would be. Okay. And what do you understand is the status of their relationship at the time of her disappearance? Of course, they went to high school together. He's a couple years behind. They were a couple, but did they break up? What was the status? They were taking a break, was my understanding. All right. So they were taking a break just like Keith and Selena.
were taking a break coincidentally right at the same time. Okay. And so did the witnesses state that the people who saw Sandra, like a friend of Sandra's who was there, Sandra spent most of the time talking to Terry and some of his friends who were also there?
That's my understanding.
Okay. Any problems at all? Anybody, any fights, any arguments,
No.
anything like that at all that you've ever heard about in the last 34 years?
No.
Okay. Moving on to later that night, they're at this party, and I'll talk a little bit more with Keith. I'm talking a little bit more with Keith or with Chris and Joyce about Keith's and their understanding of that night. We're just going to stick to Sandra. What is your understanding about when they left? What did people say about Keith and Sandra leaving? Did they leave together? Anybody with them? And when? What has been?
That's where it gets kind of fuzzy.
Mm-hmm.
I hear different scenarios of what exactly happened.
Mm-hmm.
But
and just give the audience some examples of different what you've heard. Just to give a sample.
Well, people's recollection of what happened isn't the same as statements given at the time.
Okay.
So,
okay. I'll help you along with this. So what you're saying is what people said in 1988 is not what they said later.
Right.
Okay. And in addition, do we have stories out there that some people say they left at 11:30 and then some people said 1:30, and in fact there's even somebody who said that she insists that she saw them there after 2 a.m. Is that correct?
Well, not the 2 a.m., but okay. That she walked them to the car, and the fact is that she wasn't even there when they left.
I see. Okay. All right, so we have some discrepancies.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any good handle if the police, once they got involved, and of course we know a lot of different groups or organizations were involved in this back at the time, do you think they have a firm grasp on the exact time that Keith and Sandra left, or do you think they're just as confused as everybody else? Your impression over the last 30-some years. Please.
I don't think they have a firm grasp on any of it.
Okay. That's what we want. I'm always asking for the truth. I always want honesty on here. So you think that they're just as up in the air about this as everybody else?
Yeah. I think it's a major cluster.
Okay. That's fair enough. Thank you for being honest with that. So all we really know is that your opinion is that she was supposed to be home by 2 a.m., and they would have had to have left the party at some point to get her home by 2 a.m.
Yeah.
All right. So whether they left at 12:30 or 1:30, but it's not that long of a drive, correct?
No, it's about a 20-minute drive.
Okay. So they're at this party. Just seems like a regular college party. And I have to ask you this. Have you ever heard anything over the last 30-some years that anything other than alcohol was being done at this party?
No, I hadn't. No.
Any marijuana? Any ecstasy?
I would assume there was, but I haven't heard that.
No. Any? Of course. Once again, putting myself back at the time I went from college from 89 to 93. Maybe ecstasy was just starting to kind of be anything. Any illicit drugs? Have you ever heard any of that being at this party?
No.
Okay.
Did not hear that.
Okay. So, of course, we know that Sandra did not get home. And what is your understanding of what your family did when she did not get home by 2 a.m.? For example, did they try calling Keith's house? Did they go out and drive around? Did they try calling any of Sandra's friends? What happened?
My mom did wake up and notice that she wasn't home. So she sat on the couch and waited for a little while, and she fell asleep on the couch.
Okay.
And then the park rangers called the house about 8:30 in the morning.
Huh.
and asked
saying
if
that,
Sandra was at the house.
all right, and this is because
And
the car
that's
had been
when
found.
everything started.
Okay. At the time, when your parents got that call that Keith's car has been found, and once again, we're going to go into that maybe a lot more in depth with Joyce and Chris. But what was your family thinking right at the time when they find out that Sandra's with Keith and Keith's car is found out in the Colonial Parkway? Do you know what was going through their mind at the time?
Um,
Any ideas?
well, I was on my way over there already, and this was before cell phones.
Yeah.
So she meets me in the driveway and wants me to get a friend of mine who has is a canine officer, wants me to go get her to go search the parkway. And it takes me a few minutes to figure out what she's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, she wouldn't have gone to the parkway.
Okay.
Why am I going to the parkway? And they said she went swimming, and I said, well, that's bull. She didn't go swimming.
Okay.
I said, I'll go up there and get this straight. Mm-hmm. And they said, oh no, they don't want you to go up there. And I said, well, I don't get what they want. I'm going up there.
Okay.
So I wait for a little bit to see what's going to happen. And I call a couple of my friends with York County to see if they can get me some information. I get the stall tactic from them, and I finally just go up there, and that's when I find everybody and his brother in the car, trampling all over everything. And I go high and to the right, and
you kind of went off on all of them?
I did. I was like, okay. I don't know what kind of idiots you are, but they did not walk down that hill right there to go swimming.
Okay.
The water was 40 degrees last night. They did not go swimming.
Mm-hmm.
My sister doesn't like the water. She did not go swimming.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't walk that way naked to go swimming. You're contaminating a crime scene. Get out. Stop.
And who were these people?
The park.
I mean, not by name, but what organizations were they?
The Park Service.
The Park Service. Okay. And you said you were in law enforcement. By that
time, it was too late.
It was too late. And you were in law enforcement at the time. What department did you work for, and what was your role? What was your occupation with that
By that time, I was working for the government.
Oh.
Yeah, so I wasn't with the city anymore. Okay. So there wasn't much I could do.
All right. Okay.
So I think it was 2 days later before the FBI got involved. Mm-hmm. And by that time, it was completely ruined. They called in dog teams and spent 2 days dragging the river, and 100 people had walked all over that crime scene.
Okay. So you show up there, the park rangers are in the car, and we're going to get into the close stuff in a little bit. They're in there. And what is, maybe you need to understand this. Is this federal property where this was?
Yes.
Okay.
It's Colonial Parkway. It's
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is federal property. So the park rangers are there. FBI gets involved a couple days later. And
they only get involved because they hear the news report on the radio. Nobody ever called them. Mm-hmm. They heard it on the radio, and they're like, maybe we need to go check this out. Mm-hmm. Nobody ever made the phone call.
The FBI? Okay, the FBI 2 days later. Okay, so when it comes to local jurisdictions and any local jurisdictions involved, being that this is federal property, maybe you can explain that to all of us.
Well, York County tried to investigate in the beginning, and they started. Newport News started at the college because that's where they were last seen. Mm-hmm. But as soon as the FBI got involved, because it was on federal property, everybody got pushed out. And we as family members all said, why can't you work together, since it's a multi-area issue. You don't know exactly where the crime scene is. They were last seen here. The car appears to be dumped here. Why can't you work together? Well, they tried that, and it did not work well.
Right. Now, we've run into that several times before, and other disappearances for sure. Okay. We're going to probably come back to that in a bit. When does your family eventually meet with the Call family, Keith's family, and you have like a powwow, a meeting regarding all of this? And what is said, regarding all of this? What are the conversations before?
The only thing that we ever tried to do is fundraisers to raise money for a reward.
So you don't know of a time. Once again, I realize you have your own life to live. You have a job. You've moved out and everything, but you don't know about any conversation or meeting, very private meeting at one of their houses where your parents got together with Keith's parents and they talked this all over about what went on that night and all of that. You don't know anything about that?
No, I don't.
Okay. Don't know if that ever happened. Okay. Was it somewhere in here? You show up there, the park rangers are doing their thing. How soon was it after that you personally found out about the other murders that are seemingly connected to the Colonial Parkway? Was it right around then, or was it later?
It was later.
Okay, so in those first few days, then that never came to anybody's mind in any conversation you ever had?
Nope. They still are not putting two and two together.
Okay, very interesting. Okay. So when the missing persons report got filed for Sandra, did it get filed with the FBI? Did it get filed with the park rangers? Who actually got the report?
I think Mom filed it with York County because she's lives in York County.
Okay. So you were actually there that morning. You got to see the car right there along Colonial Parkway.
Yes.
You got to see right where they found it. How close would you say, being that you got to see it firsthand, how close was it to the road?
It's right on the road. It's not one of those that you would pull off to make out. It's one of those that you just pull through, read the sign, and keep going.
So you would say that the car was within 50 feet of the road?
Less than that.
Less than that. Okay, so that's where it was. Okay. And so already, I guess what we're saying, I have a question for you. And of course, as the listeners know, we follow outlines for all the interviews that we do for Unfound, and Terry had received it. So this is a question. So at least on the surface, and I know you reject this, and I of course I do too, but it did, at least on the surface, look like the two went for a swim. I know you reject that. But could you say that could you say when you saw the car in there that somebody was making it look like they went for a swim? Is that your
Somebody tried to make it look like they did.
Okay, and I think this is very important because Terry was there very early on, just a few hours after the car. She got to see it firsthand where the car was. This isn't something that was told days later or anything. You saw the car where it was on the parkway. You know where the river was, and you know the state of the clothes and everything. But somebody seemingly made it look like they went for a swim, even though it was like 40-degree weather and 40-degree water temperature.
But they didn't do their homework very well because there's no way you could have walked down that cliff.
Okay. And you got to look at that. Okay. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the siblings of Keith Call, Joyce Call Canada, and Chris Call. Chris and Joyce, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you for having us.
You're very welcome. And thank you for appearing on both audio and video for this interview. Let's start here. We'll start with ladies go first. Joyce, what can you tell the listeners about the Call family in the 1980s? How would you explain it? Of course, we're going to give your brother, Chris, a chance to talk about it too, but just very quickly, what would you say, like the culture of the Call family?
Gosh, I guess we were just a typical family back in the 80s. There was 5 of us. I've got 4 brothers, and Keith was the middle. And when Keith did disappear, I was already out of the home, but I was close in the area. But we just grew up a typical family. I mean, we got along pretty good most of the time, and then when we didn't, we rolled around the floor fighting.
Uh-huh.
Basically, we had a pretty good family life, you know.
Uh-huh. So, Joyce, you were one of the oldest
I
children?
am the oldest.
You
I'm the
are
oldest.
the oldest, and then there
I
were
am.
4 boys after you.
Yes.
Wow, look at you. Okay.
Mhm.
And how much of a difference in age are you and Keith?
7 years.
So 7 years older. Okay, thank you. And moving down to Chris, where are you in the pecking order of the children?
I'm like 2 years younger than Joyce, so the second oldest.
Second oldest. Okay, so
Yes.
you are Keith's older brother, and Keith, you said is in the middle. And maybe we need to give a shout out at this point. We don't want to forget the other siblings. Your 2 other brothers, what are their names, Chris?
Douglas, and Stephen.
Doug and Stephen. Okay, and they were younger than Keith. Just a few years, many years.
Doug was just a few years younger. They were pretty close, but Stephen was quite a bit younger. He was the youngest of them, much younger.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So we have Joyce leading the way, and 4 boys after that. That is unique. It's 5 kids and 1 girl. Okay. And parents married. Everybody living under one roof together.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. And Chris, you had by the time that Keith disappeared, had also moved out, correct?
Yes, I wasn't far. I was in Gloucester Point, not too far at all. Actually, very close to where it all happened, actually.
Okay. All right. So you 2 both were out of the home by this time. So I guess then Keith was the oldest child living at home
Correct.
at the time.
Right.
Okay. Very good. All right. So everybody living there. And I understand, Joyce, your father, we're going to talk about, of course, later. But your father was in beer distribution or something? Is that?
Yeah, he was a supervisor out at Anheuser-Busch. Of the what department, Chris? Do you remember?
He was an electrician. He was an electrician.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he was a supervisor at the Anheuser-Busch in Williamsburg, Virginia.
Okay. And your mother worked too, or just housewife, stay-at-home mom?
Stay-at-home mom.
Stay-at-home mom. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on to this now. Let's just talk about Keith in particular. I'll start now with Chris first. How would you compare Keith's personality, introverted, extroverted, compared to the rest of the children? Would you, Chris, say you were a lot like Keith, or was he like unique among the children? How would you explain it?
I would say Keith would be more extroverted, especially compared to me. And when I was younger, I was more introverted, and I still think to be introverted. He was definitely more friendlier. I mean, extroverted, would go out of his way to speak to people. Very kind soul.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I'm a kind soul too.
I think you are. I've gotten to know you. I would agree with that. Okay. So would you say that maybe the other children a little more introverted, Joyce? Were you kind of the same way, introverted? Is that how you would explain Keith as well?
Keith. How was Keith?
Yeah.
Is that what you want to know? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd say he was really friendly. He was friendly. He got along well with people. I don't remember him having really any enemies or people. I don't remember him talking bad about people either. But he was just friendly. He liked to go out and with his friends. He liked to go to the beach. He was the type of fella. I mean, he went to school and he came home and he had a part-time job and he just did things right. I don't know what it was because I didn't, when I was his age, but he was always so proud and amazed. It's like, how does he do that? He does what he's supposed to do, and he always did. And he was just, he did what he said he was going to do. He was good. He used to take my little brother to the movies on Sundays all the time, when there was kids' movies out. And it was just like, how did he get all this goodness? a little rat.
Chris.
I guess I was comparing to me is what I was doing. I was a little hellraiser.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe we'll talk about that maybe in another interview, Joyce. Chris, was Keith athletic? Was he into sports, music? What was he into?
He was somewhat athletic. I don't think he was like super into sports, but he was more into computers, if I remember correctly. He was more of a computer. They would call them computer geeks now, but he was sort of into that. And I actually think that's what he was studying.
Okay, so back in the 1980s, we're all kind of in the same age range here, kind of Gen Xers. I'm 52, so maybe going back to the 1980s, I think of like the Commodore 64, and
he had that.
That's what he had.
Yeah, Commodore 64 is the computer that comes to mind. Of course, Apple also got started in the 1980s as well, so he was into that, outgoing personality. And Joyce, you had mentioned that he had a job. What was he? What job did he have? And maybe if he was working at the time of his disappearance, maybe you can say what that is.
Well, yeah, he worked in a boatyard and local to the area because we're around a lot of water and a lot of boatyards, and so he worked in a boatyard repairing and
Okay, and that's what he was doing at the time of his disappearance?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So outgoing, into computers, maybe at least a little athletic. Sounds to me maybe a little more outgoing than the rest of the children. The way you're explaining it, nice guy, taking his little brother out to the movies on Sundays. Okay, very good. Let's move on to this. His education. If you know, and I realize both of you are out of the house by this time. Do you know why he picked to go to Christopher Newport, to that school? Did he entertain the idea of maybe going at some other schools that have popped up during talking with people like Old Dominion or Elon? Why was it Christopher Newport? Any idea? Either one.
Probably because he could drive there, he could commute there, and it was a 4-year school that he could commute to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so right, and it was fairly close. He could commute, he could live at home and go there.
Right.
Okay, and you think maybe what class was he in? Was he a freshman, junior?
He was freshman.
He was just a freshman when he disappeared.
Yes.
Second semester. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Second semester freshman year. Okay. All right. So that's why I picked it. And this kind of came up when I was talking to Terry, Cassandra's sister. And the listeners should know we're doing this interview on December 9th of 2022. And I interviewed Cassandra a few days ago, or I interviewed Terry a few days ago. But was Keith paying his own way through school, like working through school, getting loans, or what was he doing?
I think it was both. I think my parents were helping him some, and then he was probably working for spending money. I don't think it was super expensive to go to school, not like it is now. I don't think it was super expensive, but they were helping, and he was working for spending money. So,
okay, very
sounds
good.
right to me. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and any ideas about how he was doing there? Was he doing well in school? Do you even know? Once again, I realize you both had your own lives to live at the time. Any idea how he was doing?
I think he was doing rather well, actually. Okay. Right, Joy?
Yeah, I'm assuming he was. I didn't. I think we would have heard if he wasn't. We would have heard if he wasn't, and I'm assuming that he was doing pretty well. Yeah.
I think he was a B student. I mean, I think he was a high B student. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Let's move on to this. This is probably going to be a topic later, and listeners should know I have spoken to her. But let's talk about Selena. This is his girlfriend from high school. They had been a couple for what I would call several years, especially considering they were both just in their teenage years. But Joyce, maybe we'll start with you. I realize you don't know all the intricacies of the relationship, but what can you say about Selena? How did did she and Keith meet? What can you say about that? And how many times did you meet Selena? And what kind of relationship did they have?
I've known Selena for years. I guess I don't know exactly how that started. I never asked, but I'm assuming just from high school. They knew each other from high school. They didn't live very far from us, and I really liked Selena. I still do like Selena, but she was over our house a lot because they lived close, and so I would see her fairly often. Yeah.
So you thought that they made a good couple?
Oh yeah, they made a good couple. Yeah, they were. I mean, they were young, and I never knew what was going to become of it. You know, they were young, but they spent a lot of time together. They did a lot of things together.
Okay.
They hung out together.
And were they in the same grade? Or like I said, I spoke to her, but I don't remember. Were they in the same class? Did they graduate together, or was she 1 year?
I think she was a year ahead of him.
A year ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Any idea if she was a year ahead, why, if they were a couple, that Keith didn't maybe go to the same school that she did? She did not go to Christopher Newport. She went somewhere else. But any ideas?
Do you know, Chris?
I really don't know. I don't know if there really was a reason except that maybe it was more expensive. I'm not really sure. I'm sure it was more money to go to ODU.
Right. That's where she
I
went.
think he was actually planning on going to ODU.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why it didn't happen, or if he was going to transfer later on or what. But, you know, it's been a long time. But I know I remember it coming up before.
Okay, very good. And Chris, were you aware that at the time of Keith's disappearance, that Selena and Keith were, you know, now in, I guess, started, I guess, in the 1990s with Rachel and Ross, they were on a break. Were you aware at the time of Keith's disappearance that Keith and Selena had taken some time off from each other? Were you aware of that?
I was very aware of it because he stopped by my place that evening, obviously for to buy the beer, but he also borrowed some clothes. I didn't think too much of he and Sandra going together, meaning I just thought it was just, he said they needed the little break, Selena and Keith. I always had a feeling they were going to be together for a very long time. They might have been pissed at each other, you know, I'll show you, but I think they had intentions of getting back together. And I actually thought that he was going to propose to her. So,
wow.
You know, yeah.
Okay.
They were very close and they were together for many years. I think since freshman in high school, they were inseparable. And they perhaps maybe spent too much time together. So maybe it was just a little break, but I had a feeling that they would be back together in no time.
Okay. And Joyce, your impression, were you aware that they were on a break? Once again, I realize both of you had your own lives to live. But were you aware that they were on a break, or was that something you found out after Keith went missing?
I found out afterwards. I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember talking.
Okay. And Chris, thank you for bringing that up. We're certainly going to talk in depth about how you saw Keith that night and what went on. We'll get to that in a moment. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's move on to this. Keith's car plays a huge role in this disappearance. Joyce, what can you say? How long did he have the car? Was he the one paying for it? What can you say about this Toyota Celica, which, the way I remember it in the 1980s, was kind of a cool car. So what can you say about that?
He got that for a graduation present. And he loved that car. He took real good care of it, and he had the personalized license plates. You know, I guess it was kind of a new thing back then, and it had KEIFs on it, Keiths. And so, yeah, he was really happy with that car, and he got that because he, the graduation present. So he loved the car.
So Chris, when she says graduation present, so this would have been from high school graduation the year before?
Yes, from high school graduation. All
right. So he had that car then approximately for almost a year.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And did you know, this came up when I was talking to Selena, did you know that he had hit another car when he had gone to Elon University for something, and he had bumped into another car. Were you aware of that?
Yeah, I was aware of that. Yeah, I do remember that. Yes.
Yeah, that was not something that I'd heard before, and she mentioned that, and this came up in a conversation because of Selena being at Elon that night when Keith went missing, and the conversation they had before she was going there. So, all right, so he has this car, has it for a year. Was it new or used car?
I think it was a used car, like
Mhm.
maybe a couple of years old or something.
Okay, very good. So he gets this car a year before. Very cool, like I said, for the 1980s. They don't make them anymore, I don't think. But very cool, especially for a teenager or 20, early 20 something. Certainly a cool car. And I can see why I did not have like a cool car till the 1990s. So let's move on to this. Cassandra Hailey, and I will tell both of you that during my interview with her sister Terry, we just called her Sandra. Your understanding of how these two, Keith and Sandra, knew each other. Let's go with Chris first. What is your understanding?
They were in a math class together. That's what I was told.
Okay. And
Yeah.
so they were going to Christopher Newport together, and they had this class together. Joyce, before that night, had you ever heard Sandra Hailey's name before the disappearances? Had you ever heard her before?
No, I had not.
And
No.
not. And Chris, before that night, had you ever heard of Sandra Hailey?
Never. No.
Never. Okay, and we'll get to that night in a moment. You meeting him, but when he went over to your place, were you aware that he was going out with some other woman that
Yeah,
night?
he told me. Yes.
You don't. Okay. All right. So, any idea this is something they had been in a class like just that semester, or from like the beginning of the school year? Do we even know at all how long
We
they've
don't
I
known
don't
each
know.
know that.
Don't
No.
know that. Okay. I'm just going to move on to some now general questions. As the listeners and viewers know, we follow outlines for all the interviews that we do on Unfound because we want to make sure we don't miss anything and we go as in depth as possible. So both Joyce and Chris know these questions are coming. These are just general questions about that area of Virginia at the time. I'm just going to read right from the outline. And Joyce, you can go first. How aware were locals of what happened on the Colonial Parkway in 1986? And what I'm referring to is the two women who were stabbed to death and somebody tried to light their car on fire. The way you remember it, Joyce, how aware were you and locals of that crime?
Very aware. Everybody around here knew about it. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'll go to the next question and I'll direct it to you, Chris. How aware were locals of what happened a year later in 1987? How aware were locals of that one, those murders?
You mean the ones on the Ragged Island Refuge?
Yes,
Very,
that's
very, very aware.
very aware. Okay, so for both of these two murders, or technically four murders, but two groups, it got a lot of TV coverage, a lot of newspaper coverage. This is the way you both remember that.
Correct.
Yeah. Yes.
Bombarded.
Bombarded,
Okay.
yes.
All right. And maybe I have the question here. Next question, I'll go with Chris now again. Do you think that Keith knew about either of these double murders? Your opinion, Chris. Or maybe you even spoke to him one-on-one about them.
We spoke about it. Oh yeah, we were all aware and we spoke about it, especially the Parkway, because we're so close to the Parkway. And my father drives that every day.
Okay, so Keith, firsthand knowledge, you knew that Keith knew about at least the Colonial Parkway murders, the two women who were killed.
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. I'll go back to Joyce, and once again, I understand. Just have to explain it again. I realize you were not following Keith around. You have your own lives to lead. But did Keith have a curfew, Joyce?
I don't know that he actually had a curfew. I think my parents would ask for him to check in, so they wouldn't worry. I don't know, because he had just turned 20 in March. So I don't think that my parents actually had a lot of trouble, with Keith. And so I don't really know the answer to that question.
Okay, maybe I'll ask you this then, Joyce. Your experience when you were still living under the same roof as your parents, did you have a curfew?
Yes, sometimes.
Okay.
But
All right. And Nate,
Follow it.
yeah, yeah. If you didn't follow it, maybe don't want to get into that. But at least on paper, you
I have.
okay. And Chris, your experience, did you have a curfew when you were living under the same roof as your parents?
No, not really. No.
No. All right. So that was just reserved for the daughter in the family. I'm sorry to hear that, Joyce. Okay. Chris, to your knowledge, either even before Keith went missing or since, have you ever heard of Keith having any problems with anybody? Anybody you went to high school with, anybody in college, neighbors, anybody, any problems with anybody where he was working, anything like that? Any beefs between Keith and anybody else that you've ever heard about?
Never. Nothing.
Okay. And maybe since you were the last one to saw him, I'll just continue to ask you the next question. Chris, did Keith, when you saw him that night, and we're going to get into the intricacies of that interaction here in a moment, but when you spoke to him that night, did he ever mention to you that Sandra had a curfew for that night? Do you remember?
I don't think so. I don't think he mentioned that. No, I don't think it's anything we would talk about.
Okay, very good. Let's move on to this, and this is where Chris and I are going to have a one-on-one conversation here. Joyce, you can just relax for a moment. So we're going to move up now to April 9th/10th. Of course, the night, the day before, or the day of / the day before the disappearance. And Chris, you actually saw Keith that night. Maybe just explain how he ended up at your house and just explain the interaction and why he was there. What do you remember about it?
Well, I think the state of Virginia had just recently changed the age to buy alcohol from 18 to 21. I think that had recently happened within the last few months or something. So he came over, wanted to know, well, first he came over, I think, to borrow a jacket and maybe some clothes. And then asked me if I could buy him some beer. So I think it was Bush. So I think I ran up to Lou Smith's supermarket, whatever it was back in the day, and picked it up for him. And then he left. So.
How long would you say that entire interaction was between you and Keith?
Probably, it could have been maybe 30 minutes or so, because, I think we ran out together to Lou Smith's, if I remember correctly, grocery store.
Okay.
Or was it 7-Eleven?
Okay, and I realize these are very technical questions, and anytime I ask a question that you're just not sure of, you just say so. So did he call it like ahead? Did you know that he was going to be coming over, or did he just kind of show up?
I think he called ahead. Because I was sort of right on the way. I was living literally at the foot of the bridge, and no matter what, you had to go that direction. So I literally lived right off Route 17. So.
Okay. To your knowledge, of course, you were the two older siblings of Keith, so if either one of you would have been old enough to buy this beer and the age change due to the age change in Virginia, Chris, had he ever asked you to buy beer for him before, even maybe when he was 17 or 16 or something? Ever done any of that?
No.
This was the first time. First time. Okay. Yeah. Maybe, Joyce, I'll get you to jump in here for a moment. The way you understand your brother Keith, was he a big beer drinker?
No, I'm sure he did at times, but I never really heard of him drinking a lot, no.
Okay. So, Chris, getting back to you, were you then surprised when he asked you to do that? Or do you look at this now as just, well, he's just asked me to do this because the age changed? Or was it something else? What were you thinking at the time, being that this was the first time and, of course, only time that he ever asked you to do this?
Well, obviously because of the age change, but also he was going to a party, a college party, and I guess we were raised, you never go to a party empty-handed. So I guess when you throw those types of parties, everybody's supposed to bring something. So I guess that's what that was all about. You don't want to show up empty-handed.
Okay, but I just want to be clear, though. Did he specifically say that, or were you just inferring that? Just
if I remember correctly, he said, I'm going to a party. Can you buy me some beer?
okay. All right. Very good. So in Virginia, so maybe the listeners and I have never lived in Virginia, but I guess what you're saying is the legal age to buy beer in Virginia was 18 and they moved it to 21. Is that right?
Correct.
Correct. And when did they do that? At the beginning of 1988?
It would have been probably right around there. It wasn't probably within 6 months or something, Joy. I don't
Right.
remember.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember exactly.
Yeah, usually things like that, they usually just do it like the first of every year. So maybe this had been something that had been been a law for like 3 months, I guess a little over 3 months since January 1st. I will look into that and I'll try to clarify that for the listeners and everyone. So I guess what we're saying is that I guess Keith could legally buy beer, and then they changed it to 21, and then all these people who could legally buy beer in that very, between 18 and 21, then suddenly couldn't. Is that the way both of you understand it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. And with when you spoke, I'm going to just ask you this again. I know I brought this up before, Chris, but when Keith was at your place, did Sandra's name come up?
I think he might have said he was going out with this girl. He might have said her name's Sandra. I know that she lived in went to Tab High School, and they were in a class at Christopher Newport.
Okay. Given that you knew about Selena, was this something that surprised you, that he was actually not just entertaining the idea, but going through with it of being with another young woman?
It didn't really surprise me because they would have little quarrels once in a while because they were together all the time. So it didn't really surprise me, and I didn't think they were really breaking up. So it was more like perhaps that maybe they needed a little space or something.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The best as you could tell, Chris, and being that you knew, I guess Keith had mentioned this party, your opinion, the feeling, even, or maybe he said it explicitly, whose idea was it to go to this party near the Christopher Newport campus that night? Did Keith say it was his idea? Was it Sandra's idea? Did he give the impression that he was he was going along with this just because? Any ideas regarding that at all, Chris?
I do not know. I do not know whose idea it was.
Okay. So I'll just give you, this is just an example. He didn't say something like, yeah, I'm going out with this girl, Sandra, and then she suggested after we go to the movies that she wants to go to this party. Anything like that come up in your conversation with him?
Something about, he was going with the girl, Sandra, and I think they went to a movie and then a party, but that's all I'm aware of.
All right. I'm inclined to believe, and in speaking with Sandra's sister Terry, having already been interviewed, it does make all the sense in the world that it was Sandra's idea to go to this party, being that it was like near where she grew up and everything. But we're still not totally sure on that, but that's kind of the way I'm leaning. I was just wondering if, being that you spoke to Keith, if he ever gave you an impression about whose idea it was. But they both went to college there, so it could have been Keith's idea. It just doesn't seem that way, but okay. So he comes, he gets this beer, and what was it, a 6-pack, 12-pack, 24-pack? What was it?
I think it was a 12-pack.
Okay. And he leaves, and the way you remember, Chris, just like any interaction you ever had with Keith.
Yep, he leaves, not thinking anything. Obviously not thinking I'd never see him again.
Right.
He just was going out. I think it was a Saturday night, if I'm not mistaken.
It is. Yeah. That's right. It was. Yeah. Saturday night. Okay. Let's move on. Now, Joyce, I'll bring you back into the conversation here. After Keith left Chris's, what is your understanding about the night? And maybe I should just ask you this. Of course, we know about this movie that they went to. We're still not sure what movie they went to see. I am going to try to look that up and see what movies would have been in the theaters in April of 1988. But Do you happen to know, Joyce, have you ever heard, did they go to dinner first? Did they go somewhere else before they went to the movies? What is your understanding?
No, I don't know. All I know is that they went to a movie, and I don't know what either. And then they ended up at that party.
At the party at the
Yep,
Christopher
yep.
Newport campus, near the campus, practically.
Across the street. Yep.
Okay. Joyce, do you have any idea, given what you know about the area, of what, because this is a question I asked Terry, and a lot of these questions I asked Terry as well. What movie theater they could have gone to? Any idea? If you don't know, that's fine.
Well, there was Cinema City in Tab on Route 17, which was close to where Sandra lived.
Okay, so that might make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so that's a very good choice. And then they go to this party on the campus. Let's move on to this once again, continuing with Joyce. What have you learned? And I have spoken to these two people who saw Keith and Sandra at this party, but I'm sure the listeners just want to hear it directly from you, Joyce. What have you learned about that party? Keith's actions and behaviors, maybe we might call it demeanor at that party. What have you heard about what was going on at that party and how Keith was, what he was doing at that party?
Yeah, so what I've been told by a couple of the people that were there is that he wasn't really enjoying himself at the party at all. And he didn't really know anybody except for Sandra and maybe one or two other people there. And one of the people there lived, I think, was friends with Selena. And so Keith was hanging around her and talking to her for the majority of the evening. And mostly from what I understand, they were talking about Selena and just general things that night. But he was not evidently having a good time. So
right. And Joyce, I guess we could go even further, is that it seems that Sandra, of course, it's not just seems, it's a fact, that Sandra gets to this party and you, once again, from the witnesses, that she automatically knew several people there.
Right.
Right. And these witnesses, how did these witnesses say, how much interaction did they notice between Sandra and Keith during the course of that night at the party? How much?
From what I understand, there was virtually none. They kind of did their own thing, when they got to the party. And so she went with the people she knew, and Keith was with the one or two other people. I think it was one girl that he knew. Yeah.
Right.
And he talked with her most of the evening.
Right. And I've spoken to her, and we're not going to get into her name for this interview at all. All right. So that's what she told me as well. Let's move on to this. So they're there and kind of living separate lives. They're on separate dates. It almost seems like they're together. They get to this party. And then this would also goes back to whose idea was it to go to this party? It would seem, given that Keith was not having a very good time, but Sandra was, that this was probably Sandra's idea. Unfortunately, we don't know that 100%. Let's move on to this. Let's move into now the next. Maybe I should ask you this. For either of you, have you ever heard about anything other than beer being at this party? This is a question I also asked Terry. Any news about illegal drugs? Of course, marijuana was illegal practically everywhere at the time. Of course, that's changed since then. But marijuana, anything maybe harder, like ecstasy, kind of those fashionable things that were in vogue at the time. Have either Chris or Joyce, you can answer this, anything other than beer ever being imbibed by anybody at the party?
I never heard anything about that. No.
Okay.
I haven't either.
Okay. All right. So this is just a traditional 1980s beer party. Okay. So let's move on to this. Their exit from the party. And this is kind of where things get a little very vague. and it's not something, even as I'm doing this interview with you two, that I'm quite sure what to think about. But Chris, what is the best we can tell about when these two left? Keith and Sandra, did they leave together? Anybody else with them? What's the best information we have right now, 34 years later, regarding them leaving?
I'm going to be honest. It's been so long. I don't remember if anyone really remembers seeing them leaving. I remember that people saw them there at certain times, but
Right.
I don't think that's the problem. No one really actually had eyes on them leaving.
Right.
I remember.
Then Joyce, what do you say about that? About the same answer?
Yeah, about the same thing. The one person that he was there talking to the whole time, says that she saw them leave at a certain time, and that she had to leave as well.
Yeah.
But I think that's the only person that actually said they saw him leave at a certain time that came out and said it that I know of.
All right. And one of the problems we have here, and that in talking to Terry, is that the belief was that Sandra's curfew was 2 a.m. And there's maybe one or two other people that say, yeah, they left before then. But then we have this other person who I think she's telling the truth. That doesn't mean she can't be wrong, but she believes that Keith and Sandra were there well after 2 a.m. This is a huge conflict right now that I don't know if we're ever going to be able to resolve that. Okay, so it's very vague. Nobody can really remember them leaving. And I guess maybe nobody is quite sure when anybody left then. All right. So let's move on to this. And I realize you were not living at home when this all happened, but the way you understand it, in the early morning of April 10th of 1988, when Keith doesn't get home, let's just pick an arbitrary time of 3 a.m. I don't believe your father maybe was at home, but does anybody at home get a little nervous about all of this, that he's not home by 3 a.m.? Did anybody even notice?
I don't think
Chris, please.
I don't think it was they were really that worried about it because they'd never had trouble before, and he had a good head on his shoulders with a lot of common sense. So I wasn't living there, but I don't think any worry started because until they got a phone call, if I'm not mistaken, from the Park Service.
Okay.
Not to say they weren't worrying, maybe a little bit my mother, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary yet.
Okay. Maybe I'll just go from your own experience, Chris, and when you lived at home, maybe you were supposed to be at home at a certain time and maybe you were late for whatever reason, car broke down or something. What would normally your parents do if you didn't get home by a certain time? And did that ever happen?
Well, I'm sure it probably did. She was probably sleeping. I guess things were just so much different back then. We really lived in the boonies, in the country, and things like that had not started happening yet in that area. And unfortunately, it happened to us, but it wasn't a big deal. We communicated. I guess maybe we called on the phone. It just wasn't a big deal.
Okay. Joyce, I'll just ask you some pointed questions. So there's no information you've ever heard that when Keith, like I said, I'm just picking an arbitrary time at 3 a.m., that anybody in your family called maybe Cassandra's house, go out looking for him, anything like that? To your knowledge, none of that was done?
No, not at that time. Not at that time. I got a call, but it wasn't at that time.
Okay. When did you get a call? Being that you brought it up, when did you get a call?
I got a call. It was about 9:30 that morning, Sunday morning, from my mom is when I got the call. And she was, to say she was upset was an understatement. Would be an understatement.
And the car had already been discovered by that time, correct?
Yes.
All right. And we'll get back to that. Thank you. Okay. Let's talk about this, and maybe we'll just continue with you with Joyce, with this question. And we're going to talk about Chris's own personal experience regarding the car as well here in a little bit. But we're going to maybe kind of go in backwards terms. But late morning on April 10th, 1988, what we might call a coincidence, is that your father, both Joyce and Chris's father, Keith's father, he comes across the car, correct, Joyce?
Yeah, he does. He
All
does.
right. And why did that happen? How did that happen? And what did he do?
Was he on the way home from work that morning, Chris? Or
He was going to work.
he was going to work? Yeah, and so he was going along, and he saw the car, and he pulled over, and he went and looked at the car. And this is kind of what I remember them saying, is that he pulled over and went and looked at the car. The door was open; it was ajar, and he was kind of aggravated, because he was like, "This is not like my son, you know. He doesn't just leave his car." And from what I was told, my dad was thinking, well, he probably left it there, and he went with some friends. The last thing on his mind, I think, at that point when he saw the car then, was that somebody had abducted and killed him, you know.
Right.
There was no clothes in the back of the car at that time, or anything to give my dad that awful, you know. I'm sure he was concerned, but it's a lot different when you see their clothes piled up in the back of the car. That wasn't there when he
Right.
stopped.
And we're gonna get into that. Yes, we'll get into that.
And so he, from what I understand, he closed the car and went on his way. And he figured that he would be, you know, talking to Keith and seeing what was going on. You know, why is your car there? Because, like I said earlier, you know, that car was fairly new to Keith, and he was into cars. And, you know, my dad was just like, that's not like him, you know. So that was my understanding.
All right. So he's going to work. And did he normally take the Colonial Parkway to go to work, Joyce?
Every day, just about. Yeah.
Okay. And so, and unfortunately, your father's not still is deceased now, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so, what did he say? So he left the car there. What was he thinking? I mean, obviously, maybe shortly after that, he found out this was a big deal, of course. But in the moment, of course, he leaves the car there. I really realize he has to go to work. But what is your understanding of what your father was thinking in the moment? Did he think the car broke down?
I think that what my dad was thinking is that he must have gotten in the car with some other friends, and left his car there. Maybe he, you know, sometime in the night or wherever he was, that he had just went with some friends, but he couldn't understand why. And it was still just like fresh right then. And I'm sure he was trying to figure it out. In no way, shape, or form did he think that, oh my God, my son's been murdered, and this is, and I'm never going to see him again.
Right.
Which, you know, give it a fast forward another hour or two, and then it hits the fan, so to speak, you know.
Right. Right. And of course, he knew that, you know, he was at home. Keith did not get home, and then he's going to work, and just coincidentally, he runs across the car. And what time was this, Joyce, the way you understand it?
It was around the 7:00 hour, wasn't it, Chris?
6:37. Yes.
Yeah,
6:30.
something like that.
All right. So this is April. Sun would have been up by that time. Okay. So your father's going to work, comes across the car, and I guess eventually kind of just keeps going to work.
Right.
Right. And of course, this is well before cell phones. It's not like you can call Keith, call home, call anybody else, call 911. No cell phones.
I figured that's what he was going to do when he got to work, to see what was going on.
Right. Okay. Chris, anything you would like to add to what Joyce said about your father's encounter with that car? Anything?
No. It does sound probably strange to some people that my father would just kept going to work to see his son's car with no one in it at 6:30 in the morning or something. But That's what happened. And it just he didn't see anything out of the ordinary because, belongings were not in the car at that time. It looked like a normal, it was just there, parked there.
Right. And we're going to get to the close here in a moment. It's, of course, a topic I spoke. Terry and I spoke about it as well. All right. So he goes on to work. But then when was it then? You've already talked about this 9:30 a.m. time, Joyce, when your mother calls you. But what happened between your father encountering the car and that 9:30 call that then things unfortunately started to gain momentum? Chris, how do you remember it?
What I remember next is my mother calling me because I lived very close to the point, and about telling me that they had found the Park Service called and they found his car there. He's not there, etc. She was very upset. She thought it was a big mistake or something at the time. But I'm pretty sure within probably 10 or 15 minutes, I was probably on the Parkway. I was there. That's how I was very close to it. Probably no more than 2 miles. It could be a mile and a half.
Okay. So, Chris, continuing with you, Chris, then what is your impression of what happened, the best you can tell, between your father encountering the car and then this park range calls? So are we to believe that your father did actually end up getting to work and calling 911 or something? Or what actually transpired then for the park rangers to call your mother? What was it, do you think?
I don't know if my father, when he got to work, if he called my mother or called 911. I do know that somehow the Park Service I think she called my mother. Somehow they were able to find their phone number and called my mom, and the rest is history.
All right. And Chris, and in fact, you said once your mother called you, you got in the car and you drove directly up to the location.
Correct.
All right. And so you saw Keith's car there.
Yes.
All right.
It was still there. Yes.
Okay. And I have to ask you, do you remember encountering Sandra's sister Terry, who went up there as well very quickly? Do you remember encountering her?
Oh, I do. Yeah, I do. During the day, yes, I do. Let me go back. Joy, I don't remember. Had they already towed the car away, Joy? Because that was a very big
When I
deal.
came, they had it all blocked off in yellow crime tape. And I believe when I got there, which is probably about 10, 15 minutes after you, the car was gone.
I think the car was towed away already. I know they took it to the Park Service office, which is off of Route 17. They towed it to a garage there, if I do remember correctly. So that's another bone of contention. They screwed up the whole crime scene. But anyway, so that was already gone. If I'm mistaken. Yes.
Okay, so you go up there. You eventually did encounter Terry. So Joyce, you went up to the location as well.
Oh yeah, I got a call from my mom too, probably the same time Chris did, and I headed up there as soon as I got the call. I remember my mom calling me, and she was really upset. But she told me at first, she said, these people called me, the park rangers, and I just didn't. I thought somebody was playing a terrible joke on me, and I hung up on them.
Oh yes, I've never heard her say that.
Yeah, and they called me back again. And it was just like, that was the beginning of this. And so that's when I headed over to the Parkway myself.
Okay. And so you go up there, both of you go up there, you end up there, and you said there was crime tape up. They had it all cordoned off, but you said that the car got towed, I guess, fairly quickly.
Yes, it did.
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Yes.
Just before I was there.
I just want to say that even in our mind, we're still thinking we're aware of the previous murder about a year and a half or 2 years earlier,
right,
about a mile from there. And that's already in my mind.
Yeah.
We're connecting it. So I'm thinking, they just screwed up a crime scene. And then even back then, we're thinking like that. So everybody was aware of it. I mean, remembering the murder because it had so much publicity on the Colonial Parkway. So.
Right, of course, like we talked about. So that makes all the sense in the world. You show up there and you're thinking, oh my, I know what happened here 2 years ago. Oh my goodness. right? But
Exactly,
but you also know that, of course, Keith and Sandra were not found in the car. Of course, they're still missing, but you also knew that,
Yes.
Right.
right? Okay. So, all right. So the car's found there. Not necessarily we believe this now, but at least at the time, probably everybody's thinking, well, they must be around here somewhere. So were there searches done in that area? What can you say about that day, the next day, the river, dogs? What do you know about any searches that were done in that area immediately at that time for the next few days? What can you say? Joyce, will go to you. What do what do you know about that? And did you personally take part in any of it, or what?
I Yeah, there were some searches done. I know they brought dogs in. I know that they had some kind of aircraft that was doing some kind of infrared vision over the York River, looking to see, and they did find a body, but it wasn't related to our case. So
They did.
yeah, they had, I don't know if it was the which branch of service was out there, but they had some people from the service out there with nets in the water as well. So they did have a search of the pretty immediate area. As soon as it happened, they started.
Okay.
But there was nothing there.
All right. Would Chris, in your opinion, the way you understand about the searches that were immediately done, fairly thorough, pretty thorough? What do you think?
I thought it was. It was actually, and I remember saying it to myself, this is surreal, because there were helicopters flying over, there were search dogs, there was literally every branch of police, the state police, local sheriff, park service, search and rescue teams. And I remember just like, wow, this is just unbelievable. This is surreal. This is hard to believe. Yeah, I do remember saying that, and I still do. It's like, wow.
Yeah.
I still didn't find them, but anyway.
Right. In all of this, when did you find out that your father actually encountered Keith's car earlier that morning? How soon did you find that out? Keith or Chris?
Not that I'm sure it wasn't probably before lunch or something of that day. I'm sure my father left. Well, I know my father left work and of course came to the area. I don't know exactly the time frame. 9 o'clock comes to mind. 8 o'clock. It wasn't at work very long.
Mm-hmm. So. All right. So that's when you found out. So of course you were not aware. He couldn't call anybody, but he keeps going to work. And then you two get called by your mother. You show up there, and at that point, you don't even know that your father's already encountered this car a couple hours beforehand. Before that,
not at that moment, but within probably 30 minutes, an hour or so. Yes.
Yeah. So weird. Okay, Joyce. These dogs that were involved. The listeners know that I'm not the biggest fan of dogs. I think it's not really a science at all. But in any case, Joyce, what did the dogs do once they were brought to the scene? What direction did they go? Do you know what they did?
I think that mostly they went through the woods. They went down. They went down the bank on. There was a drop off from where the car was found at the York River Overlook and down to the river. And I know they went up and down those the cliffs. And they did get a scent on something, but then again, I mean, they didn't find anything, and it could have been that body that they did find in the water. But yeah,
I guess what you're saying, Joyce, is that like I said, I've been doing this for over 6 years. We talk about dogs, and I'm fairly dubious of the whole thing. But the dogs had what they would call a death scent in the water, and then. Not due to the dogs, though. There was a body found in the river not long after that.
There was, yes.
Yeah, and so it's possible that the scent, if they did pick up a death scent, it was of this person. I think it was a guy and not Keith or Sandra.
Exactly.
Okay. And I think in my talk with Terry, we got into how the dogs went like in a north direction from the car for like a mile. And then seemingly the trail split off. And like I said, I'm not sure if we're supposed to believe any of this, but that is something that was out there. In both of your When you showed up there, though, this is where we'll get into this in a moment. But when you two both got there at whatever time it was that morning, 9:30, 10 a.m., was it then your understanding that their clothes were in the car? Did anybody bring that up? Chris?
I don't remember exactly when I knew that, but it was pretty early on. Mm-hmm. It was pretty early on.
And what do you remember about that, Chris? Of course, your father did not see any clothes in the car, but when you two got to the scene, did any of the investigators, anybody there, the park rangers, say, yeah, we found the car and we found clothes in the car? Do you remember any of that, Chris?
No, I don't remember, but I do remember that my father not seeing clothes in the car or keys being in the ignition, as they stated later, but I don't remember that day or maybe that morning. The Park Service, I mean, nobody was giving us a lot of information anyway.
Right.
And the Park Service.
Okay. All right. So these searches are going on. They're going out in the river. They got a helicopter or some sort of light propeller plane flying overhead. I think everybody on the scene is thinking, man, didn't we just do this 2 years ago for the women? And I'm sure that was in a lot of investigators' minds. Of course, the difference is those women were actually in their car, and somebody actually tried to hide that car and burn it, whereas with Keith's car, it's just sitting there right next to the road. Of course, he and Cassandra are not in it, and really there's no signs of violence. But I'll ask both of you this, and Chris, you can go first. In your opinion, and I realize you are not a seasoned investigator, but is it your opinion that at least the scene looked like the two had gone to that spot and gone for a skinny dip in the James River? Do you think that just in general, that's what it looked like?
I think that's what they were someone was trying to make it look like. It was the York River, not the James River.
York River, thank you.
Yeah, so I think someone was trying to perhaps make it look like that. Don't think it would be. It was still, the water temperature was probably in the low 40s then.
Mm-hmm. Right, and your impression, Joyce, being that you were there as well. You see the car's there. The clothes for the most part are there. Is that your impression that somebody made it look like they went to take a skinny dip in the water?
Oh, like Chris said, they might have been trying to make it look like that, but never. I mean, I never would have. It didn't work on me. I mean, I never would have thought he would have went. I didn't know Sandra, but I know Keith, and he wouldn't have went down there skinny dipping for 1 minute. No, he wouldn't have. I mean, not even the fact of it being cold. He was kind of shy to begin with. He's not going to go down there and go skinny dipping with somebody that he doesn't even know, let alone it's April and it's freezing. It was just so far-fetched.
And maybe I'll follow up with this for you, Joyce. Maybe I'll follow up with this question. And in fact, your opinion is, and we've talked about this, where the car was, it was not easy to get down to the river anyway.
No, it wasn't. I think it was like 20 or 30 feet down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So why would they even go to that particular pull-off, overlook, they call it, for that one, when there was others that you could just walk out?
That's right. Chris, is that your impression as well? Even if somebody were looking to go swimming in the York River, let's just say in the hottest day in Virginia in July, that's not probably the place you would go to.
Well, I guess if you really wanted privacy, perhaps, but I don't think that there are easier places about a mile up there was like a beach. So yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And once again, this is April in Virginia. It's not Alaska, but it's not warm either. It's certainly not Florida in April. So the water would be cold, and I probably have looked up and seen what the temperature was that night. I forget right at this moment. It was probably in the 40s. Probably got down into the 40s, April in Virginia, correct?
That's about right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, now a bunch of more kind of questions that I also asked Terry, of course, just changing the name. But Chris, we'll start with you. To your knowledge, had Keith ever been to that spot before?
Where the car was found?
Yes.
I think we've all been to that spot before. We grew up in that area. So
Okay.
yes, been to that spot before.
Okay. Joyce, had Keith, any conversation you ever had with him, had he ever talked about the Colonial Parkway, going to the Colonial Parkway for any reason, just hanging out, anything?
I don't know. I don't remember it actually being talked about, but when, like Chris said, when he put it in perspective for us, it's a road that we used all the time. Although it's a historic road for visitors to come in,
Yeah.
us locals that live here, it's just a thoroughfare for us. So it's used all the time.
That's how we got to the
So he's very familiar with the Parkway. Did he hang out there on a regular basis? No, I don't think so. But was he on it? I mean, he was 20, by that time he was 20 years old, and we've lived here all our lives. And so he's definitely familiar with it. I don't know that he would hang around on it. Just like, my dad traveled it every day just to go to work.
Right. Maybe I'll go back to Chris on this. Can you think of how often would you say Keith was on that road? Did he ever have to go on the Colonial Parkway for work, or did any friends live up that way? Anything like that?
Oh, okay. Going to Busch Gardens. So that's how we would go to Busch Gardens. So, so we went to Busch Gardens all the time. We all had seasons passes because my father worked for Anheuser-Busch. So it was part of sometimes it could be part of our daily commute.
Okay. And we have to understand this is just a pull off right there along the road, and the car was sitting just within 20, 30, 40 feet of the road, right?
Right. Yes.
This wasn't actually a pull off area that you parked in, which they did have a lot of those. This was just like a pull off and pull back on the road, read the historical sign or look over it. But it didn't have parking spaces.
Yep. All right.
Also, the Parkway. I was just going to say, the Parkway is part of the national park, so there's not going to be any pay phones or anything like that on the Parkway. Nobody lives there. There's sometimes not even lighting. It's very, very quiet place. So.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Had your family as a group ever gone up the Colonial Parkway when you were all younger to go to the different spots, like the historic spots?
Yes,
we used to go to the picnic area from time to time when we were young. It was called Ringfield, which is closed now, and fish and have picnic every once in a while. You remember that, Chris?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It was a nice picnic area. It closed not long after what happened with Keith and Cassandra.
Okay.
Yep.
I mean, within months, probably.
Wow. Okay. And and I've spoken to Selena, but to the both of you, did she ever say anything about the two of them ever going up to the Colonial Parkway for any reason? Joyce?
Yeah, I do not know.
Okay.
I don't know.
All right. And Chris, your understanding, how far was this car from where the two murdered women were found, to your knowledge?
Half a mile, maybe?
Pretty close.
It's that close.
Pretty close. Okay. And listeners should know I am going to be doing a companion complimentary video that will be on the Unfound YouTube channel, along with, of course, this entire episode. And diagramming these locations and showing where Christopher Newport is, where Sandra lived at the time, where Keith lived at the time, and all of this all in one video. It's probably going to be a little bit long video. I haven't done it yet, but this will probably sort a lot of these things out. And I understand there are a lot of videos and maps already out there about all of this, including the murders, but I'm just going to stick to Keith and Sandra's disappearances. Okay. And those are the first halves of interviews I did between December 6th and December 9th, 2022, with the siblings of Keith Call and Sandra Hailey. You will get to hear the second halves in part 2, and I will tell you what you can expect in addition to the interviews in part 2 at the end of this episode. Before I get into this long part 1 summation, I hope you will all go to Unfound's YouTube channel, where I go over the locations detailed in this part 1. There will also be a companion video for part 2. So, how did this all get started? And why these disappearances to work on behind the scenes for so long? At this point in this episode, I just have some notes in front of me on the screen. I'm not going to be reading from a script because, frankly, to type it all out would have taken hours and hours and hours. So I'm going to do this very much like how I do an update episode. This all got started back in July of this year of 2022. I was up in Illinois for the disc golf tournament, Masters Worlds. You might remember that in Peoria, Illinois. I was up there. I stayed at my buddy Dave's place, one of my best friends from college. And you should know, finding people, finding guests is a constant job here. Yes, sometimes we have people that reach out to us or people that email me, message me. But I would say 80-85% of the guests that you hear on Unfound are people that we reach out to. Facebook pages, websites, news articles, things like that. Well, I will tell you for me, and this is giving you a little behind the scenes of how this podcast all comes together. When maybe I'm stuck, maybe I just really can't choose what to do, who I'm going to reach out to next, or I'm just can't really figure things out. There is a list that I have that I got from the Charley Project of all of the disappearances that have Facebook pages. And so I go to that and I have it, I copied it over into a document. And what I do is I'll just start anywhere, just randomly on that list, and it's alphabetical by last name. And you should know, most of the disappearances on the Charley Project do not have Facebook pages. So this is not as long a list as you might think. And I will just randomly look at names on the list, no real rhyme or reason, and then go to that Facebook page and read about the disappearance, see if somebody, if it's active, have there been recent posts, things like that. Not very scientific. In fact, not scientific at all. Just looking around. And as I was going through the list, I came across Richard Keith Call and Cassandra Lee Hailey. Two names that I am pretty sure I just don't remember them. I'm probably saying that over the years I came across their names once or twice, but no recollection of it at all. And one of the things you learn in looking at a list like Megan has put together at the Charley Project of all these Facebook pages, disappearances that have Facebook pages, is that usually when you see two names together like that, it's usually children. That it's a mother who has abducted the children or something like that. But of course, what caught my eye was that, of course, Keith had the last name Call, and Cassandra had the last name Hailey. So I'm thinking, well, probably they're not. They might be underage. They might be 10 years old, but I don't know if they're brother and sister. What's going on here? So I decided to take a look and see what their disappearances were about, because obviously they went missing at the same time. It was only then that I went to the Facebook page connected to their names that I discovered, oh, they're part of the Colonial Parkway murders. I, of course, know about the Colonial Parkway murders. I've heard about them. Of course, we don't do murders on Unfound. But I have to admit, at that time in July of 2022, I had no idea. I'm just being totally honest. This is just me, Ed, being honest. That I had no idea that two disappearances were considered to be part of the Colonial Parkway murder phenomenon, as what I called it earlier in this episode. Had no idea. I thought that they were just all murders. I knew that they were unsolved. I knew that there were couples that were murdered together, something like that. Had no idea that two disappearances, two people disappearing together, were considered to be part of this. I was stunned. And I will even admit that just knowing about the Colonial Parkway murders, I have to admit, I didn't even know where the Colonial Parkway was. I thought it was like up in the Smoky Mountains or something. Maybe I need to take a geography class. So I thought, well, this is interesting. And so I started, of course, I have a newspapers.com account, started looking at that. And it was sometime in August where I decided I really want to cover these disappearances. It seems like their families are out there, although I had not spoken to anybody in either of their families that it seemed like they did interviews. Although I had not listened to these shows yet, I knew that there had been series that have been done regarding the Colonial Parkway murders, all of it put together. I knew that there were podcasts, there were YouTube shows, and so I kind of understood that if I'm going to do this, I'm probably going to be very successful at having some of the family members of Cassandra and Keith involved. So it was very positive, had a very positive attitude. But I also knew in reading about all of this that, as I stated earlier in this episode, that their disappearances had never been looked at on their own. My opinion is the reason that they aren't looked at on their own, whether you think that all this is connected or not, is because as a person who just does disappearances, I can tell you, I think most people just want to stay away from disappearances. That's my personal opinion. I think that's one of the reasons that police departments play hot potato with them, as I've talked about many times. So looking at it, seeing that they're being mixed in with these murders, I thought, this is something that is worthy to take a look at in a vacuum. Looking at their disappearances, not totally forgetting that these murders happened, but obviously nobody has done this before, mainly because there aren't too many people in the last 30-some years that specialize in disappearances, probably. It looked like a good opportunity to move these disappearances for the investigation of them forward, understand them better, and maybe in doing that, maybe we can even get as far as possibly understanding these murders better. And at that point, I didn't know what to think. Maybe they're all connected, maybe they're all related, and I'm really not even going to get into that until part 2. I also thought that there's a point that I want to get to, being that this is my choice of careers, this is my work. I think it's about time, over 6 years into doing Unfound, that I put my theories, my education, my work up against the FBI, up against the Park Service, up against those local Virginia law enforcement agencies, up against other show hosts, up against true crime authors. For example, the guy that wrote the Colonial Parkway book that came out about 5 years ago, and everybody else who has looked at all of these tragedies, these murders, this disappearance. It's about time that I get to see, can I make more sense of it than all of them? Can I explain it in a better way? Can I do better analysis than anybody else regarding all of this? It's about that time. So, and really, as soon as I started to really think about it in this way, I realized I was going to be coming to these 2 disappearances from a different angle than everyone else. Once again, going back to, I just don't think that people who really get into true crime and write books and do these shows and everything, they really understand disappearances in particular, because I'll keep saying it, disappearances and murders are different. Very well could be that disappearances are murders. And in fact, I think I was talking about this recently, that I estimate that 62% of the disappearances we've covered on Unfound are murders. And you should know, a listener did the same exact study and came to the exact same percentage. So there must be something to it. But disappearances and murders are different. And I think this is a mistake that has been made since the day Keith's car was found on the Colonial Parkway. And we'll get to that later. So then the work started. And so I started going to the newspapers.com articles. There have been tons and tons and tons of articles written about Keith and Sandra's disappearances. I read the Colonial Parkway book, although only 2 chapters of it are devoted to the disappearances. I ended up contacting Chris, Joyce, and Terry, who couldn't. They did fantastic interviews. I think you've already heard that. Really came forward, really ready to talk, and I cannot thank them enough. I even went to Web Sleuths and went through threads and threads and threads and threads, reading what people have been saying, going back years about these disappearances and even the murders too. Listening to other shows on the Colonial Parkway murders. For example, the brother of one of the women who was killed in 1986 has a show on YouTube. I listened to several shows that he's done about all of this. Although I have yet to speak to him on the phone, I'm still like to do that. I spoke to the 2 witnesses who were at the party that night. They have similar stories, but the huge difference is their memories of when Keith and Sandra left. Much more information. I think overall, what I can say about Keith and Sandra's disappearance, especially since all these years they've been mixed in with the murders, is that there's much more information than you would ever find on any disappearance Unfound has covered. Even more than Brian Schaefer. In fact, I would only say the only other disappearance I think that we've covered that comes close to the amount of information and shows and everything, podcasts and everything else, is Flight 370. Surely. That's the way I look at it. The only disappearance that has gotten more attention over this time is Flight 370. It's the only one that surpasses, I think, Keith and Sandra's disappearances within the context of the Colonial Parkway murders as a whole. So now that I'm done with that, so that's how this all came to be. It started out as I didn't realize that there were 2 disappearances within the Colonial Parkway phenomenon. Looked at them and said, I think this is something that I want to devote a lot of time to, because I think that these disappearances have been looked at in the wrong way. And I think it's, on top of everything else, that if I want to be a person who teaches people about disappearances and thinking about them more clearly, then I have to go up against all those organizations and groups and departments that I stated before, because that's where I want to get to be. So that is how this all came to be, and I've been working on it since, like I said, August. Still, of course, doing the episodes and giving those weekly episodes as much attention as I ever have. But in that downtime between August and September and now, instead of me maybe playing disc golf or whatever else, that extra time has been devoted to these 2 disappearances exclusively. So then, regarding what you've heard from the guests so far, and in this summation, I'm only going to talk about the topics covered so far. I may foreshadow what you're going to hear in part 2, but really the rest of this summation, my insights from now to the end of this recording for part 1 is just about what has already been established in those interviews with Terry, Joyce, and Chris. And then I will do the same in part 2 in my summation, and that's going to be a little bit different, of course, because in the second part, we're going to get into the investigations and some of the quirks and a lot of the things that went on that have made trying to investigate these disappearances very difficult. And before I get into this, these major points that you should take away from part 1, I'm going to be mentioning some unfound disappearances. So you may want to refresh your memories before you listen to the rest of it. Because that could be helpful. So major point number 1, although anybody can go missing at any time, Keith and Sandra were in a demographic where people are very unlikely to go missing. It's very, very important to understand. And if you've been listening to Unfound for a long time, or maybe just a recent listener and you're catching up going back to the episodes way back in 2016, you know that we don't cover too many disappearances. That's just the way it is. But we don't cover too many people who have disappearances who have no mental health issues, no abusive relationships, no addictions, no money problems, no stalking incidents. It's very, very rare. Certainly they exist, and I'm going to read off a list here in a moment, but think about how often those topics come up in Unfound episodes. I would say 95% of the time. Usually. So some, though, where that did not come up, some of those where that didn't come up, Jason Jolkowski, Kristen Modafferi, Alicia Markovich. And what's important, and there are several more, but those are just examples, yet what is most important about those? Foul play is the consensus theory on all 3 of those, and if I were to look at the entire list and really, really nail it down, I'm sure it would be the same for any others that would go on this list. So when you have people who don't have any mental problems, no abusive relationships, no addictions, no money problems, no behavior issues, all of that, usually means that foul play occurred. Now, that may not be shocking, given that I think everybody pretty much thinks that foul play occurred here, but we have to think about that. That is very, very important, that how rare somebody like a Keith or a Sandra going missing is. If you can avoid all those, the odds of you going missing are very, 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 very low. So we might then start thinking about, it must have been a very unique situation for them to go missing. But foul play is usually the consensus theory when people who are living pretty straight-laced lives go missing. So another major point, the second major point that we should think about given what we've already heard in the interviews for this part 1. What are the odds that Sandra showed up at a party where her ex-boyfriend Terry was by accident? Fairly improbable. You might think of that line from Casablanca, of all the gin joints in all the world, she had to walk into mine. If you've ever seen Casablanca, that's kind of what I think about here. But what I'm saying here, it's reasonable to think that this was Sandra's plan all along. That she knew her ex-boyfriend Terry was going to be there and she wanted to go see him. And we're not sure if she told Keith about it or not. Obviously, Keith knew that they were going to be going to the party, hence the beer. Whether he knew her ex-boyfriend was going to be there or not, who knows? But I just don't think that Sandra ended up at that party by accident. Now, what does this mean? It means that people, who knows how many, could have known Sandra and Keith would be there that night. So their abduction could have been planned beforehand. Something to think about. In addition, given that Keith got beer, this also shows that he knew for sure the two would be going to the party, as I already stated. Then who did the two of them tell? I would have to think could have been a large group, could have been a small group, but I'm inclined to believe that there were multiple people who knew that at least Sandra was going to be going to that party and Keith would be with her. Yes, to plan something out like this, an abduction, a disappearance like this would be complex for anyone. However, for a stranger who, let's say, pulled the two over, and I'm going to be getting into this in part 2 because this is a popular theory that the two were driving home and got pulled over by a police officer or a fake police officer. To say this again, yes, to plan something out like this would be complex for anyone. However, for a stranger who, let's say, pulled the two over while pretending to be a cop who didn't know they would be at the party, this would be way more difficult due to the unpredictability, especially at night, especially since there are two victims and not one. But what is most important to understand is that their abductions could have been planned before they ever got to the party. Why? Well, I'm going to give you some examples, once again, from Unfound's own history. Jody Husentrut, first and foremost. Somebody who knew she was leaving that morning waited at least an hour. Remember, she was late leaving that morning, and that person still waited for her. Nobody believes she got abducted on the spur of the moment. Somebody planned it out. Somebody knew she left those mornings at a certain time. That person was out there waiting for her to abduct her. Might have been stalking her for a month and she didn't know it. Who knows? We just don't know. We don't, of course, know who caused Jody's disappearance. But somebody surely planned it. Meaning these things can be planned if somebody knows the victim's schedule, which certainly people would have known for Sandra and Keith. Because like I said, I'm inclined to believe that Sandra planned to be at that party because she knew she could see her ex-boyfriend Terry and many other people. And given that this was Sandra's area of Newport news, I'm guessing she knew multiple people at that party. And she might have told them, oh yeah, we're going to be stopping over and going out with this guy and we're going to stop over. That would not surprise me at all. And I don't think it should surprise anybody. Another example from Unfound's catalog of disappearances. Susie Lyle. Somebody knew she was getting off the bus that night alone. We can think, of course, some people think it was Israel Keys. I don't particularly believe that. A lot of people believe that it was her boyfriend / ex-boyfriend. We're still not clear on what the situation was. Some people might even think it was the father of this boyfriend / ex-boyfriend, but nobody believes somebody was just randomly sitting there, right? Somebody knew she was getting off that bus alone that night. So once again, this can be planned. Another example where it's very, very clear. Pearl Pinson, who was walking to school. Her killer had surely seen her walk that way to school before, and that's how he knew to be there at that particular moment, abducted her, surely killed her. Very sad. And then if you'll remember that episode, he was finally tracked down and he went out. He was shot by police while trying to get away. Surely planned. Surely had knew Pearl's schedule and planned to abduct her. No doubt about it. Another one, Tyler North. His ex-wife and her boyfriend, I think, will be going on trial here come 2023. He was lured. So they planned it all out. Planned to get him to go to that park. She lured him with sex. They were divorced, but they were having sex. Nobody knew about this until after. She lured him there, and they killed him. These things can be planned when killers have prior knowledge. It's a very, very important point I want you to take away from this part one. And it's much easier to do this when you know the person, you know the schedule of that person, in contrast to somebody who's just going to do this on the spur of the moment, like I said before, somebody like playing fake cop and pulling Keith and Sandra over while they're going home that night. It's much more likely people who knew these people, knew their schedule, studied them, than just some random stranger who didn't even know them until that very second when they encountered each other. I have a lot more to say about this in my summation for part 2. The third major point that I really want you to think about as you take your time and listen to this and get ready for next week's part 2. We have covered a lot and I went through the entire 275 disappearance list. We have covered a lot of disappearances with cars being left by water or people being seen or disappearing near water. I'm going to read them out here. Like I said, if you're not familiar with these disappearances, I'd go back and listen to them. First, cars found by water, but no proof the owners were there. Jake Latchley left his truck, was found on a bridge over the Mississippi. Tiffany Daniels, up there in the Panhandle right next to the Gulf of Mexico. J.R. Mullihan, North Carolina, Atlantic Ocean. Bradley Brooks, Corpus Christi, right there on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico. Holly White, car found next to a bridge, a popular suicide spot over the Rio Grande in New Mexico. Angela Freeman, of course, her car found next to a river as well. No proof that those people who owned those cars left them there. Their cars were found near these bodies of water. Now, people who were last seen near water. Shane Fell with his car. And in fact, it's at least a little bit, you could say, like the disappearances we're talking about here. But Shane Fell surely wrecked his car, called his brother. Brother shows up. Shane not there, never to be seen again in Louisiana. Ben Archer in Delaware, last seen within feet of the Delaware River. Kevin Newen, close to a river. He would have had to have walked over a bridge that went over this river on his way home that night. The Pickering Six. Jace Martin, next to the Mississippi River. That's a very recent disappearance. Bill Underhill, Minnesota, also near the Mississippi River, last seen near it. Renee LaManna, Ocean City, New Jersey, ran away from her sister's beachfront home. That was the last place she was seen near a body of water. We have it. What I'm saying here is what I'm showing to all of you, whether you realize it or not, is I and all of you who have listened to all these episodes, we have a ton of experience in this area with people and or cars involved in disappearances, and they are next to bodies of water. A lot of information that we can use on all of them to apply it to Keith and Sandra's, whether you believe that they went up there in the car and something happened, or somebody else put the car and they were abducted from somewhere else. We have a lot of information we can tap into, a lot of education. But there is one huge difference between all of those people, all of them, and I will name them all again if you want to go back through. Jake Latchley, Tiffany Daniels, J.R. Mullihan, Bradley Brooks, Holly White, Angela Freeman, Shane Fell, Ben Archer, Kevin Newen, the Pickering Six, Jace Martin, Bill Underhill, Renee LaManna. Keith and Sandra have one huge difference than all of those people. And I'm not going to tell you what that is. I'm hoping you can figure it out for yourself between now and part 2. Because I think this plays a huge role in deciphering what happened here. It plays a huge role. We're going to have to bring in a lot of different thinking into this, but Keith and Sandra are different than the rest of those people. What is that difference? And the final topic, so those are the 3 major points. First of all, they are in a demographic that usually does not go missing. Number 2, it's clear that people knew that at least Sandra was going to be showing up for this party, meaning their disappearances could certainly have been planned. And number 3, we have a lot of experience with cars and or people being left or being last seen near bodies of water, whether they be a gulf, an ocean, or a river, or anything else. So the final topic before I wrap up this part 1, and this was the final question. Remember how I always do those 3 questions for all the episodes now. The last question, number 3, was, why do some killers leave dead bodies behind while others hide dead bodies? Why is that? This is something new. This is something that I added to the school presentation I did at Nova Southeastern University back in September. This is an idea that I've been working on. In fact, the idea came from the beginning of working on these disappearances. It started in August, kind of came to me in September, and I thought, well, I'm going to try it out when I do the presentation at Nova Southeastern. So once again, the question is this, and I don't know if anybody has thought about this before, but why do some killers leave the dead bodies behind while others hide their dead bodies? Why is that? There are, of course, pluses and minuses to each. Because this is important. Why? Because in all the other Colonial Parkway murders, the victims were left behind. Keith and Sandra are the only 2 who are missing. Something to think about. Of course, some reasons the killers hide victims, you have to think about it because it's a lot of work. Hiding people is a lot of work. I don't care if it's digging a hole. I don't care if it means carrying them out into the middle of the woods, just hoping nobody will find them, or cutting them all up, or burning them. It is all big-time work. Still, we know that many people choose to do this. Why? We might think about recently, this is an extreme example, but the Idaho massacre that is big news. It's been like a month since these 4 students were killed. We could easily look at that and say, well, why didn't the killer take them away? Well, there's 4 of them. That would make it a little difficult. But maybe, on the other hand, we can look at the murder of Missy Beavers, which is coming up here on 7 Years Unsolved. She was by herself. Why didn't that killer take her? She was all alone. Could have done that. Why didn't this killer do that? So, I've come up with 3 reasons why killers do this. Why do they cause their victims, why do they make their victims disappear after killing them? Why do they make sure that nobody can find them? Because we have to remember something. Of course, the big overarching idea regarding this is people don't like to get caught. People don't like to get caught speeding. They don't like to get caught cheating on their taxes. And killers don't like to get caught. To the point that even we know in some of these school shootings and other things, these people would rather commit suicide than be caught. So these are the 3 reasons that I've come up with why killers and these disappearances that we kind of think of as being murders, why they make their victims disappear. Number 1, leaving the victims where they are will reveal who the killer is. For example, husbands can't leave their dead wives in the house. It would then be too obvious who the killer was. The guy's not really going to say, well, yeah, some guy came in and killed my wife and I didn't see anything. And some of these, or we could say Zoe Campos. Carlos Rodriguez killed Zoe Campos in his house. There's a reason he didn't leave her body behind, because it would have eventually been found there and he would have been caught right away instead of waiting 5 years. Same way with Andrea Bowman. Same way with Austin Pivo. He got into a fight with those guys after getting dropped off. The reason they didn't leave him in the house is because leaving him there would have quickly shown that they were the ones who killed him. Instead, they took him out into the woods and buried him, and luckily, he was eventually found. And a very good example of this very recently is the Unfound Now I did for Elizabeth Capaldi, where I did the Unfound Now, and then just a few weeks later, her husband is charged with a murder, and he led investigators to her body. There's a reason he didn't leave her in the house, because he would have been caught right at that time. So once again, the first reason killers make the bodies disappear is because leaving the bodies wherever they are will quickly point to who the killer is, even without any forensics or anything. Number two, speaking of forensics, the number two reason is because of forensics. That the killer believes that there is DNA or something on the body that he or she cannot get rid of, can't make it go away. And if the body is left behind, with the science that we have today, will eventually show who the killer is. So that's reason number two. And we can think of, and we have to remember that for Keith and Sandra's disappearances, it was 1988, so this is before DNA started, just to make that point. They do it for forensic reasons. Leaving bodies behind will scientifically prove who the killer is. So they have to get rid of the bodies so no studying, no science can be used. Some of the examples from Unfound's catalog of disappearances: Tyler North, who I already talked about, Unique Harris, and Ashley Simpson. That's a case from Canada that is now solved. Tyler North's, by the way, all those three of those, by the way, are all solved. Even though the killers attempted to get rid of them, even though I don't think Unique Harris has been found yet. But Tyler North, his remains were found. Ashley Simpson's remains were found. But surely all of them were murdered, and the killers got rid of them for reasons of forensics. You might even be able to put Ashley Simpson's in category number 1, too. And number 3, the reason that killers get rid of bodies instead of just leaving them wherever they died is possession. Keeping bodies somewhere allows killers to relive the killing experience over and over. No, we don't really have any unfound disappearances that are like this necessarily. Maybe Carlos Rodriguez was going back out into his backyard and reliving killing Zoe. Maybe. I don't have any information regarding that. But this is a well-known thing with serial killers who have put bodies in certain places and then occasionally go back to to view that body. It could be out in the middle of the woods. It could be in a storage locker. It could be anywhere. But these killers put these bodies in places that nobody else knows, and then they can go and relive the killing over and over and over and over. So those, I think, are the 3 main reasons that killers don't leave their bodies, their victims' bodies behind, their victims' remains behind. What's important to remember about all of this, what I'm also saying, is that staging of a scene like might have happened with Keith and Sandra comes second. What comes first is the decision to make the victims disappear. The staging doesn't happen if the disappearance idea doesn't happen. For example, if Keith and Sandra were murdered, why not leave them and the car wherever it happened? You have to think about that. I would also say that when we have disappearances where a suspect says, well, the person is still alive, this is not the reason the person's body was hidden. This is a byproduct of one of the above 3 reasons. The reason to get rid of the victim comes first. Then the stories start. Very important to understand. Please think about all of that from now till next week as you start to think about Keith and Sandra's disappearances and try to make sense of it. All of that is very, very important in analyzing their disappearances and trying to come to an answer as to what really happened to them. Whether they got abducted or maybe they really did go up there and went into the river. But all of that is important to think about. As for next week, part 2, I'll start that episode by going over the generalities of the three other sets of murders from 1986, 1987, and 1989, along with a couple other murders that some people have included in this string of violence. But I can assure you, it's not going to be this comprehensive coverage, very in-depth, looking at every single detail of those murders. But I just want to give you a decent idea of them. Then the second halves of the interviews will play, the ones with Terry, Joyce, and Chris. From there, I will then quickly go over the most popular theories concerning the murders and the disappearances, and why some people think they are connected and other people think they are not. I will then look at some suspects who have been named over the years. You can imagine it's been 34 years since at least the disappearances. And so some names have come up. And I have to admit, a couple of these people are fairly compelling. I'm not going to dispute that. But I'm going to take a look at them and give you my opinion of them. And there are some details about them that I'm going to really have to talk about, in particular, a letter that one of them wrote, a very long letter. I'm not going to go through all of it, but a couple points in that letter certainly caught my attention. Then somewhere within all of that, I'm going to answer the question I asked all of you earlier in this episode about the distinct difference between Keith and Sandra and all of the other people I listed whose cars or they themselves were last seen near bodies of water. Trust me, the answer is important. Then I will get into how I look at these two disappearances and how I narrowed all of the choices, all the different theories, down to my own. And yes, for once, maybe the first time ever, I will publicly reveal on an episode of Unfound what I think happened in a missing persons case. Until then, I leave the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. Right now, while you are in your podcast platform, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, wherever, give Unfound a 5-star review, a thumbs up, whatever that platform allows. I thank you for listening. I'm at Densel, and you've just finished this episode of Unfound.